Hi, and welcome everyone to another RIS interview. This time we are highlighting the much anticipated specialist issue of our journal, the Review of International Studies. And I'm absolutely delighted today to be talking to one of the authors included in that special issue, Tamara Trownsell, who has an article called Recrafting Ontology. Tamara is an independent researcher in international relations, ontology, and cosmology. Welcome, Tamara.
Thank you.
And many congratulations on your article.
Thanks so much.
So I wanted to start our interview by asking you a little bit about yourself and your academic journey. How did you, get to this point, and how did you become interested in this particular area of research?
Thank you so much, Juliet, for the question and the whole interview. The fieldwork that I did for my master's in international communication in Ecuador just left me fascinated by the country politically, culturally, and historically. So I returned there for my doctoral fieldwork for my dissertation in international relations. So I was there for 2 years, and I followed closely some conservation projects that were taking place in various sites, and they were internationally funded. And I was particularly riveted by the clashes in procedures, understanding shared meanings, and life practices between the members of the community and the members of the institutions, right? And so this led me to really start focusing on Andean philosophy, or what they call in the Andes cosmovivencias, to better understand the clashes and how this affected the project outcomes. So my learnings, I realized, though, once I started writing, had much larger implications, not just for conservation projects, but for the whole dissertation, or for the whole discipline of international relations. And so I decided to refocus my dissertation on the implications of understanding ontologically Andean forms of knowing and being for knowledge production within the discipline of international relations. And that dissertation was called Robust Relationality, Lessons from the Ontology of Complete Interconnectedness for the Field of International Relations. And while I now much better understand many of the Andean concepts that I was addressing in the dissertation, I still feel like it outlines very well how the predominant ontological register that we use in international relations, which is based on separation, necessarily engages in ontological reductionism when we are trying to understand ideas or concepts or cultural practices that are based on interconnection as the primordial existential commitment, meaning that people are starting to understand existence from the position of interconnection as opposed to the position of separation. So to me, what I started to understand is that if we continue to just use a singular register within the discipline, this is really going to curtail our ability, first of all, to understand alternative strategies for encountering complexity in the world, but also just with our larger goals of the discipline to increase peace or decrease conflict, if we're not able to effectively translate across these ontological registers, then we're not really seeing the whole picture. And so it's really hard for us to actually fulfill our disciplinary goals. That was the basic point of my dissertation.
Interesting. And so could you, thinking about the article that you've written for RIS, could you give us a brief outline of it?
Sure. The article consists of 3 sections. So in the introduction, I make the call for the need to recraft ontology, just because our current understanding of ontology is disallowing of multiple registers, right? Or multiple existential commitments. And so basically, even though we're having debates about whether it's the study of being or what other aspects we're taking into consideration, it doesn't take a step back to actually look at the fundamental primordial existential commitments. So that's in the introduction. And then section 1 shows how the register of separation is used pervasively in the discipline and points to the kinds of fissures that accompany making this kind of existential commitment. And then in section 2, what my focus is to bring in another register based on interconnection or relationality, and I contrast both of them. And what this allows me to do is to show how, when you start with a different or distinct ontological commitment, you can actually understand the concepts that come from that in a much more robust way, and also the ways in which our understandings are actually reductionist through the other registers, right? So that's the major focus of section 2. And then the third section re-examines the fissures that I identified in the first section. And I take the tools that are developed in the second section to show how this commitment to separation continues to enforce ontological reductionism. And that necessarily reinforces exclusion and domination of other peoples, of other ways of life, of other species. And so it ends with a discussion of how this precludes the ability to engage in a world multiple.
Okay, so your article advocates for pluralizing the ontological register in the discipline, yet traditional debates about ontology and IR have already been plural in nature, with discussions over monism and dualism or scientific and philosophical ontology. Why is it that you are still arguing for the need of ontological pluralism?
Okay, so I think to answer this question effectively, I still feel compelled to answer the question, why do we need to worry about ontology and IR, right? So this is like a big question, because one would say, oh, but we've had all these debates. It's been on the menu. We've been discussing ontology since forever, right? And so I think there are two major observations that have been made very clear in two different literatures. First of all, the literature that I like to call the post, non, and beyond the West literature, or now called the global or globalizing IR literature. They're basically trying to make the observation of the provincial nature of the kinds of knowledge that we are able to generate within international relations as a discipline historically, and that because it's provincial, we're not capable of encompassing or engaging effectively the variety of perspectives that may exist in the world, and that this actually is going to fail to contribute to the general disciplinary goals of decreasing conflict or increasing peace. And then the other observation, stemming mostly from the environmentally focused or oriented literatures, is that most of the time we're still generating knowledge that is very much anthropocentric in nature within the discipline. And so we're not really going to be effective in coming up with strategies for mitigating environmental or epidemiological catastrophes of today, simply because the lens that we're using or the register that we're using is still anthropocentric in nature. So that's the first step, is why do we have to worry about ontology? Because if we don't worry about ontology, we're effectively contributing to the very obsolescence of the discipline, because we're not actually overcoming some of these issues. So with that said, what I'm trying to argue, and this goes a little bit based on what I've already said in the interview, is that the forms of pluralism that we're seeing in terms of these debates and ontology that you're addressing are actually pluralism that derive from forms of pluralism that derive from a similar ontological base, or what I would prefer to say, besides just calling it an ontological base, because they're saying, oh no, but there's all these differences, is a similar commitment, existential commitment to separation. Right? And even if we have multiple relational approaches within international relations and within social theory today, one of the arguments that I'm making is that they're still hinging on certain pillars of separation. And this is why they're able to communicate with one another, is because they're sharing this existential commitment at the base. And so what I'm trying to argue is that what we need to pluralize is not the debates. We need to pluralize the ontological registers that we're capable of using as IR scholars, and that we actually need to start getting training in using multiple ontological registers, meaning with multiple primordial existential commitments. So we need to understand what the commitment to separation generates or is capable of generating, and also how that lens or that register is able to understand things that are generated or concepts that are generated by distinct ontological or existential commitments, right? And the goal, at least for me, is that once we are what I like to talk about in terms of once we are ontologically competent per se to use these multiple registers, we can actually start to see what has been historically and systematically erased by continually insisting on using one single register based on a monopolistic existential commitment. So that's why I say that we actually need ontological pluralism in the discipline.
Okay, so what does it mean to recraft ontology?
Okay, so I work with this really awesome group of scholars called the Doing IR Differently Collective. And when we had a writing workshop in Galapagos, we started talking about the need to recraft the discipline, a particular group of us, and we were talking about the need to relationally recraft the discipline. And so there was an article that came out in EIR about recrafting international relations through relationality. So we're talking about this need to start to collectively and intentionally create new spaces within the discipline. And then recently, David Blaney and I further developed this concept, drawing on Nick Oneff's legacy in light of the discussions on worlds and the call to world multiply in a discipline that has been worlded in a particularly limited way. And this particular article showed up in a Globalizing IR special issue that was led by Pinar Bilgin and Gulsha Kapan. So the article here in RIS addresses more specifically how in order to strengthen the discipline's ability to engage with multiplicity in global politics, we first actually need to recraft how we even approach the concept of ontology. And that's the basic argument in this particular article. Because reproducing a monopolized ontological register based on this commitment to separation just doesn't allow us to either overcome our anthropocentric bias or the underestimation or the continued underestimation of the potential contributions of other ways of knowing and being when we're trying to confront and mitigate these global environmental and political challenges. So for me, a recrafted understanding of ontology helps create the space for the acknowledgement of and training in multiple ontological registers. And that will help us in better and more effectively gauge those who come from other approaches.
Okay. So what does your argument imply for relational approaches that are already well established within the discipline?
Well, first, I think what's really important to underline, and it's really, really important. I mean, just thinking even of Simone de Beauvoir, all of us are engaged in a world where we are, or in various worlds, but where we're trying to always respond to those around us. And if those of us that are in an academic discipline, we're trying to establish ourselves, et cetera, what we start to see is that even those that try to be really revolutionary in their thinking are still having to express themselves in ways that are understandable, obviously, to those that they're trying to be revolutionary to, right? And so this creates a situation in which you're having to find that common language so that you can make yourself understood. So the first major point is that I do not want at any moment for this to seem like a major critique to relational approaches that have really tried so hard to create new spaces, whether that be post-structuralism or constructivism or new materialism within the discipline. I think that their work is really important. The issue, though, what I want to make clear is that in so doing, meaning in so continuing to embrace particular commitments to separation, what they're doing is hamstringing their own efforts. And this actually has two major effects for me. First of all, they're neither in a place to fully overcome the anthropocentrism. And what's really interesting in the article is that I try to show the anthropocentric bias of new materialism that is what's their major critique of the post-structuralist. So I'm also saying that, yes, even new materialists have this issue that they're having to confront, is how you overcome this anthropocentrism. And also, they're unable to fully grasp the implications of forms of being and knowing that start with this full commitment to interconnection, because the lens necessarily is reductionist. Even if it's really relational, it's still reductionist in understanding concepts that come through a full commitment to interconnection.
Okay. Okay, so summing up the article, having and all the things that you said, what would you say are the main takeaways from your article that people can, listening to this interview, can take away from all of this?
I'd like to underline 4. First, the first takeaway is that we generally have generated knowledge in the discipline based on a singular ontological register, despite the existence of other registers. And this is something that I think is really important. And then that even the more relational approaches within the discipline still remain wed to the pillars of separation. So what they've done is they've become better and better at making the fissures smaller, but the fissure is still there. And that fissure has the implications that I addressed earlier. And so what this means, though, is that the way in which we understand others who base their logics on distinct ontological commitments, if we do not know how to use multiple ontological registers, we're still going to be understanding, perceiving, and interpreting these other ways of knowing and being in a reductionist fashion, which means that then we're still lending ourselves to this exclusion or to this domination of others and of other ways of knowing and being. And this actually, for me, the very biggest point is that this has huge implications for our ability to strategize effectively in the face of today's complexity. Because the major argument for me is that in order to face complexity, we really need to take ourselves to the next level of not only insisting that there's only one ontological register, but we need to take ourselves to the next level of becoming competent in using multiple registers, which will allow us to better engage complexity.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much. So it's been really, wonderful to interview you, and thank you for sharing your research with us.
I really appreciate
as complex as it is, it's been wonderful to hear. You've explained it to us in a very good way, I think. For those people who are keen to learn more, you can read Tamara's full article as well as some others from the specialist issue in the first view section of the RIS website. If you are a BISA member, you can access this free of charge as part of your membership. You just need to log on to your account. And if you're not a BISA member, you might want to see if you can gain access to the journal via your institution. And while you're here, please do look at the BISA website, which is www.bisa.ac.uk. You can learn all about our association, all the wonderful benefits a BISA membership will bring you. So please do take a look. Thanks once again to Tamara. Thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much. You take care, Juliet.